On the afternoon of December 5, 1945, 5 U.S. Navy training aircraft departed from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on what was expected to be a routine navigation exercise. The flight was designated Flight 19. It consisted of 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, each carrying a pilot and, in most cases, additional crew. All aircraft were serviceable. Weather conditions at the time of departure were considered acceptable for training. The mission profile was standard. The pilots were to fly east over the Atlantic, conduct bombing practice at a designated target area, then turn north and finally return west to base. Such exercises were conducted frequently. The route was well known. There was no indication that this flight would be different from dozens before it. Shortly after the exercise began, the first signs of difficulty appeared. Radio transcripts preserved by the U.S. Navy indicate that the flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, reported navigational confusion. He stated that his compasses were not functioning properly and that he was unsure of his position. Other pilots in the formation expressed uncertainty as well, though some believed they knew where they were and suggested corrective courses. The situation did not immediately escalate. Confusion during training flights was not unheard of, particularly among less experienced pilots. However, Taylor was an experienced aviator with over 2,500 flight hours. His concern was taken seriously. As the flight continued, radio communications revealed increasing disagreement within the group. Some pilots believed they were over the Florida Keys. Others believed they were farther north. Taylor reportedly believed they had flown east too far and were now over the Gulf of Mexico, a conclusion that would later prove critical. Based on this assessment, Taylor ordered the flight to turn northeast, believing it would lead them back toward Florida. This decision conflicted with the suggestions of at least one pilot who argued that flying west would be safer. The radio transcripts suggest hesitation, confusion, and overlapping transmissions, but no panic. As daylight faded, weather conditions deteriorated. Reports indicate increasing winds and rougher seas below. Fuel levels became a concern. The Avengers were not equipped for long-range navigation without visual reference, and once darkness fell, orientation became more difficult. At approximately 6:20 p.m., Taylor transmitted a message indicating that the flight would continue flying until the last drop of fuel was used, after which they would ditch the aircraft at sea if land was not located. This was not an unusual procedure under the circumstances. Naval pilots were trained to ditch in formation when necessary. This was the last clearly documented transmission from Flight 19. No distress call was recorded. No emergency beacon was detected. The radios fell silent. When the aircraft failed to return, the Navy initiated an immediate search and rescue operation. Given the number of aircraft involved and the known fuel limitations, the response was extensive. Air and sea units were deployed across a wide area east of Florida. Approximately 2 hours after Flight 19's last transmission, a PBM Mariner flying boat was launched as part of the search effort. The aircraft carried a crew of 13 and was tasked with scanning the suspected flight path. It never returned. A civilian tanker later reported seeing an explosion in the air around the time the PBM was expected to be operating in the area. An oil slick was observed on the surface of the water shortly afterward. The PBM Mariner was known to have issues with fuel vapor accumulation. and previous accidents had occurred under similar circumstances. Despite this, no wreckage from the search aircraft was conclusively recovered. Over the following days, the Navy conducted one of the largest air-sea searches in its history. Hundreds of thousands of square miles were covered. Ships, aircraft, and submarines participated. Floating debris was reported intermittently, but none could be definitively linked to Flight 19 or the PBM Mariner. No bodies were found. The official Navy Board of Investigation reviewed the available evidence, including radio logs, maintenance records, weather reports, and pilot histories. Initial findings suggested navigational error compounded by deteriorating weather conditions. Lieutenant Taylor's decision-making was examined closely. The board initially attributed responsibility to pilot error. This conclusion was later softened. The final report listed the cause of the disappearance as unknown. What made the case difficult was not a lack of information, but conflicting information. The radio transcripts showed confusion, but not incompetence. Weather records suggested worsening conditions, but not extreme ones. Equipment malfunction was reported, but not confirmed. The disappearance of the search aircraft added another layer of uncertainty. Importantly, there was no single moment of catastrophe recorded. No mayday. No sudden silence following distress. The flight did not vanish abruptly. It faded out of contact.
Over time, the absence of physical evidence allowed speculation to grow. However, when examined strictly through the surviving records, the case remains grounded in human error, environmental factors, and incomplete data. 5 aircraft, 14 men, 1 routine training flight that never concluded. By nightfall on December 5, 1945, Flight 19 was officially missing. What happened next, and why no trace was ever found, remains the unresolved core of the case. In the days following the disappearance, the U.S. Navy focused on reconstructing the final hours of Flight 19, using radio transcripts, navigation charts, and known procedures. What emerged was not a single failure, but a chain of small uncertainties that gradually compounded into an unrecoverable situation. At the center of the analysis was Lieutenant Charles Taylor. While experienced overall, Taylor was unfamiliar with the specific geography of southern Florida and the Bahamas. Records show he had previously reported navigational difficulties in the region. This detail would later become significant. The primary issue appears to have been misidentification of location. Evidence suggests that Flight 19 may have been flying over the Bahamas when Taylor believed they were over the Florida Keys. The two regions share superficial similarities from the air, particularly under fading light and broken cloud cover. If Taylor assumed he was over the Gulf of Mexico rather than the Atlantic, his decision to turn northeast would have taken the flight farther from land instead of toward it. Compasses were another factor. Taylor reported that his instruments were malfunctioning. Other pilots did not universally confirm this, but the radio traffic indicates enough doubt to undermine confidence. In a formation flight, uncertainty in the lead aircraft can quickly spread. Even pilots who believed they knew the correct heading were unlikely to break formation without direct orders. As daylight diminished, visual navigation became increasingly unreliable. The Avengers were designed for combat and training, not long-duration over-water navigation without clear reference points. Once darkness set in, the chance of regaining orientation dropped sharply. Fuel exhaustion was inevitable. Each aircraft carried enough fuel for approximately 5 to 6 hours of flight. By the time of the last transmissions, Flight 19 had already exceeded that window. Standard naval procedure in such circumstances was controlled ditching. However, ditching at night in rough seas with limited visibility drastically reduced survival chances. Despite extensive searches, no confirmed wreckage from Flight 19 was ever recovered.
This absence has often been treated as extraordinary, but it is not unprecedented. The Atlantic in that region is deep with strong currents. Lightweight debris can disperse rapidly or sink. In 1945, search technology was limited. Sonar coverage was minimal. There were no satellite systems. Large areas could only be visually scanned. The loss of the PBM Mariner search aircraft added to the perception of anomaly, but investigators treated it as a separate incident. The Mariner type had a documented history of in-flight explosions caused by fuel vapor leaks. The tanker's report of an explosion and oil slick aligned with known failure modes. While tragic, the disappearance of the search aircraft did not require an extraordinary explanation. Nevertheless, the coincidence of two losses in the same operation left a lasting impression. In the years that followed, the Flight 19 case was frequently cited in popular media as evidence of unexplained forces. However, many of these accounts relied on selective use of the record. Later reviews found that some radio quotes had been altered, taken out of sequence, or dramatized. Calm uncertainty was transformed into panic. Ambiguous statements became definitive claims. When stripped of embellishment, the original transcripts show something more ordinary. A group of pilots attempting to reason through a problem with incomplete information, under time pressure, in worsening conditions. The Navy's final position reflected this ambiguity. While early reports leaned toward pilot error, later summaries emphasized that responsibility could not be assigned conclusively. The disappearance was ultimately attributed to a combination of navigational uncertainty, environmental factors, and operational limitations. In short, Flight 19 was not lost in a single moment. It was lost gradually. A wrong assumption about position, a disputed heading, failing daylight, fuel running low. Each factor alone was manageable. Together they were not. What remains unresolved is not how the flight likely ended, but why no physical trace has ever been definitively linked to it. The ocean provided no confirmation, only silence. For investigators, this absence is frustrating but not inexplicable. For the public, it has become the central mystery. Flight 19 occupies a space where documented human error intersects with incomplete evidence. It is a reminder that even well-trained crews can become disoriented and that the sea does not preserve answers. The case does not require extraordinary explanations to remain unsettling. Its power lies in its realism, in the knowledge that routine operations can fail without warning, and that some losses leave behind no final record. 5 aircraft departed on a training mission. None returned. The official file remains open, not because the facts point to something unknown, but because the final moments were never observed. And in aviation history, what cannot be observed cannot be closed.